Rana Abdelhamid, congressional candidate running in New York's 12th district. Rana, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be in
Yeah.
conversation.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you. You are a Justice Democrat. You're a progressive running to challenge Carolyn Maloney here right in our backyard in a district that both encompasses the western part of Queens, but the Upper East Side. And, it's not hard to guess where Carolyn Maloney lives.
Right, exactly. It's really a tale of two districts. It's one of the most unequal districts in the country, one of the most unequal places in the world.
Right. And there are other parts of New York, parts of Brooklyn, Greenpoint that are in this district. But, it's one of those bizarrely drawn districts. But I mean, that also makes for a campaign. I don't know. I'm curious how you're approaching it. You have to appeal to a bunch of different people. It seems, though, like Maloney has trended more towards representing the wealthier interests in the city and in the district. And your approach has been a bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually was born and raised in Queens. I'm from this district, raised in this district. Representative Maloney obviously has been in office for close to 3 decades now, and her focus has really been on certain parts of this district for so long. And she has not engaged with the parts of Queens, parts of Brooklyn, and parts of Manhattan that have not been her natural base and the wealthiest parts of the district. In fact, with the new lines that were drawn, she was actually quite public in stating that she didn't want any part of Queens or any part of Brooklyn in her district, which is, quite hard to hear your own representative say that she doesn't want to represent you anymore. And then actually see like parts of Queens and parts of Brooklyn being cut out. And so much of this race has been about making sure that the communities that have not been centered in our electoral process are finally feeling like they're being heard and feeling like we're able to build political power in collective.
So you grew up in Astoria, you grew up in Queens. I mean, right now, Astoria, Western Queens in particular, is a ground zero for gentrification in the city. I mean, I'm here in Brooklyn, so I know it intimately. And in terms of just these high rises being built all around us, I mean, what would you do as representative to combat that? And I guess maybe we could start first with your personal experience with that kind of gentrification.
Yeah, and so it's really heartbreaking because when people think of Astoria in the context of like housing justice or movement work, it's always like Astoria's gone. Like, people almost give up on it because gentrification has been happening for a really long time. I mean, my family, rising rent costs impacted our housing situation maybe like 15 years ago when I was just a teenager. We were pushed out of our home. My family ran a small business here in Astoria, off of Broadway in Queens. And, I really saw my parents struggle to keep our small business alive. And eventually, because of rising rent costs, we lost our small business and lost our livelihood, right? And it was a very difficult time. And even just being in Astoria, walking around, so much of it has changed. West Queens, so much of it has changed because of the luxury developments that are constantly going up, despite the incredible organizing that has been happening. And so for me, coming to this race is so much about an understanding that we need systems-based change, systemic change to fight for housing justice across the city. West Queens is also home to the largest public housing unit in all of North America. And when people think about New York 12, people do not think about the fact that we are home to Queensbridge. And so we are running on a housing justice platform, and we're centering this reality of gentrification, lack of funding for public housing as a key part of our platform.
Yeah, I'm hoping you can expand on that a little bit because Eric Adams just broke up a houseless encampment and then went to then he went to that party. I mean, might have not been on the same day. I'm hung up on that because it's such a stark contrast.
I saw that too. I was like,
yeah, right. It's just a credit card party. We have not in this country emphasize public housing from a federal level. It's been decades, I believe, since there's been any funding. But even here in the city, as a way to not just combat houselessness, but make sure that gentrification is not the problem that it is. What would you do as the representative of New York 14 to make sure that public housing is not only maintained, but that it's increased in its presence here in the city?
Yeah, you know, as a representative for New York District 12, what's really important is to see exactly what you're saying, the model for public housing as a permanent solution for the lack of affordability in the city. We know that close to 50% of renters across the city are rent burdened. We know that when we leave it up to the market in general, right, to build housing, oftentimes that housing solution looks like the luxury development that we're seeing. What we need at a federal level is we need a national rent control. So we're increasing the number of units that are rent controlled in the city. What we need is we need to fully fund our public housing so people aren't having to live with mold or having to live in the middle of the winter in cold because there isn't a proper heating system in their building, or having to deal with the reality of climate crisis in their buildings because of lack of proper infrastructure. And we need to expand the number of public housing that exists in the city. There's real opportunity for us to do this. We know that there are so many vacant units across the city that are not being used, and the very dehumanizing, criminalizing approaches that current Mayor Adams is leveraging to actually address some of these challenges, while he's simultaneously proposing a budget that defunds homelessness services by $600 million, shows that we aren't really caring to address this cause and address these issues at its root cause of the issue, but rather just, you know, trying to put a Band-Aid solution over it to kind of push it under the rug.
I mean, I feel like there's a certain section of wealthy people in the city that would just rather not see certain people. They just rather them not be out of sight, out of mind, as opposed to actually dealing with the problem. So your platform's very progressive, Green New Deal, Medicare for all. I mean, what, I guess, motivated you to run, and how do you identify yourself as a progressive, as a democratic socialist? I mean, would you be a part of the squad if you were elected to Congress? I mean, how do you perceive your candidacy as it fits into like this larger leftist surge of candidates that we've seen over the past few years?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I always say, you know, is I'm a community organizer. I'm a movement person. I come from organizing in New York City since I was a public high school student. Like, that has always been my focus. I'm a self-defense instructor. I'm a healing justice facilitator. I came to this work as a working class person. I came to this work as a survivor of a hate-based attack, as a Muslim woman. And what I'm going to be focused on in my tenure as a representative, as someone who's organizing electorally, is making sure that my North Star is always the communities that are organizing across New York City, that have been left behind by electoral politics, working class families, people of color, public housing tenants, Section 8 tenants, and progressive people across the district who really care to make New York City a place where everyone can survive and everyone can thrive, because that's not the city that we exist in right now.
Right. And you mentioned your activism there. You have a nonprofit that's worked in the gender violence space. Can you talk a little bit about your work in that area and how that made you who you are today, your candidacy, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a survivor of a hate-based attack. I started a nonprofit that's focused on building safety and power for women and non-binary people across the country and across the globe. We do self-defense training. We do healing justice training. And doing that work really showed me so many things. I mean, when people talk about the shelter system, that work always reminds me of the reality that our shelter system is so overwhelmed, right? That in the middle of the pandemic, people who are survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence were having to isolate with their abusers because they had no other option. They had no other place to go because of the reality of our housing crisis in this city. And so that, in so many ways, that work has shown me that our communities have the power to keep ourselves safe, that if we invest in civil society and organizations, if we invest in trauma-informed response, and if we invest in proper anti-racism education, our communities will be safe. And if we actually address these issues from an anti-poverty lens and a lens that is empathetic and humane, that we would really have a city that could thrive. And so that is a lot of what the work has shown me.
And lastly, I was hoping you could touch a little bit on teachers unions in general, but nationally we're seeing such an attack on education. It's a twofer for Republicans. They get to attack gay people and trans people. And at the same time, they can undercut teachers by basically threatening them. If you decide to teach about the gay agenda in classrooms, you could be ousted. But particular to New York City, and I'm from Jersey too. Like there were a lot of charter schools, and there was a lot of democratic undercutting of teachers' unions. I mean, there's the bigoted, insane ways the right does it, but there are ways that Democrats who, under the guise of school choice, have undercut both public education and teachers as well. How would you approach that as a representative in regards to charter schools and also supporting teachers' unions as well?
Yeah, I'm a huge supporter of New York City public schools as someone who is a graduate of New York City public schools, as someone who had the opportunity to conduct self-defense and safety programming over the past couple of years in New York City public schools. And I know that, New York City public schools are also severely segregated. There's a lack of funding. We need to expand Title I funding. We need to make sure that teachers have the resources that they need. And we need to move away from this system that is so overwhelmingly reliant on standardized testing, right? And makes it so difficult for teachers to actually do their jobs. And also the reality is right now, especially within the context of the pandemic, within the context of this current political climate, so many students and so many teachers are severely overwhelmed from a mental health perspective. And we need to invest in counselors. We need to divest from the school to prison pipeline. And these are all things that I would stand for at a federal level to make our schools more effective for students across the city, not just for some students who have access to things like charter schools or alternative programming to public schools, but rather really invest in our public school system.
Well, that's great. Where can people learn more about your campaign and help out in any way?
Yeah, so we're a 100% grassroots funded, grassroots powered campaign. If you're able to contribute and support, volunteer with our race, like definitely feel free to reach out at www.rana4congress.com. And we'd really appreciate your support in whatever way possible.
Awesome. We're going to just put this on the screen here. This is your website. The Act Blue link here. We'll just pop this up right here, just so people have a visual understanding where they can go. Rana, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time today. Rana Abdelhamid, congressional candidate running in New York's 12th district, and the primary's in June, right?
Yes, June 28th.
June 28th. All right, check it out. Thanks so much, Rana.
Thank you so much.